This video was brought to you by Brilliant, and the first 200 people to use the link below will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. As you might have noticed, things aren't going particularly well for Putin at the moment. Sanctions have hamstrung the Russian economy, and the Ukrainian army have started recapturing territory around Kyiv, while the West continues to send arms to Ukraine. But as well as these more recent difficulties, Putin is also facing a more persistent problem in the form of Russia's demographics. Like much of the developed world, Russia's fertility rate is well below what's known as the replacement rate, and Russia's population has already started to decline. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at Russia's demographic crisis, whether Putin can do anything about it, and how the war in Ukraine is only going to make matters worse. Before we get into Russia specifically, a bit more on demographics more generally. In order to maintain a stable population, a country needs to have a fertility rate, that is, the number of births per woman, of about 2.1. The extra 0.1, by the way, is necessary to counteract childhood mortality and premature death. But if your country's fertility rate is below 2.1, then without significant immigration or increases in life expectancy, then your population will start to shrink. While this might not sound too bad, low fertility rates are politically and economically difficult because they mean an older population overall, which means a heavier tax burden on the young, working population. We actually did a video about this a few months ago, so you can go and watch that one if you want to find out more. But essentially what you need to know is that much of the developed world has a fertility rate below 2.1. The US and UK, for example, have fertility rates of about 1.7. Looking at fertility rates alone, Russia's demographics don't look too bad, at least by Western standards. Today, Russia has a fertility rate of about 1.5, roughly on par with the EU average. However, unfortunately for Putin, this figure disguises the magnitude of Russia's demographic crisis, and that's for three reasons: its death rate, emigration rate, and population age, all of which are worryingly higher than average. Let's start with Russia's death rate. Essentially, as a young person, you're a lot more likely to die in Russia than other similarly developed countries, and therefore be unable to have your own children. Russia has a life expectancy of just 73 years old, and a male life expectancy of just 68. For context, Poland, which until 2014 had a lower GDP per capita than Russia, has a life expectancy of 78 and a male life expectancy of 74. As you'd expect from a country with a low life expectancy, Russia also has a conspicuously high mortality rate, i.e. the number of people who die in Russia each year. According to latest data, Russia's mortality rate was about 13.3 per 1,000 people. Again, significantly higher than similarly developed countries. Russia's higher than average mortality and mediocre fertility rate have meant that, for the last 3 decades, Russia has seen more deaths than births, which naturally means a shrinking population. These deaths aren't just old people either. In 2018, 25% of all deaths in Russia occurred before the age of 60, far worse than many other countries. On to the second reason that Russia has troubling demographics though: emigration. Putin has tried to compensate for this natural shrinking population by encouraging immigration to Russia. And, well, it's half worked. Russia takes in somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 immigrants annually, and now has the 4th largest immigrant population anywhere in the world, behind only the US, Germany, and Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately for Putin, while migrants are coming in, Russians are also going out. When polled, a growing number of young people say they plan on moving abroad, and emigration has shot up over the last decade or so. Even more worryingly for Putin, these emigrants are remarkably well educated. About 40% have some form of tertiary education. Substantial immigration explains why, despite impressive immigration flows, Russia has been unable to compensate for its natural population decline. And as such, Russia's population has declined every year for the last 3 years. Anyway, the The third and final reason for Russia's demographic issues is their aging population. Ultimately, Russia suffered a crippling demographic shock in the aftermath of the Soviet Union. The fertility rate dropped from 2.1% to 1.4%, and the male mortality rate basically doubled, as well as life expectancy falling by about 5 years. Basically, in the 90s, no one in Russia had any kids, which is why Russia's population pyramid looks like this. That inward slump in red reflects the fact that, because very few people were born in the 90s, today Russia has very few 20 and 30-year-olds. Again, this is bad news for Russia demographically, because, well, those are the people who usually have children now. This is part of the reason why the UN expects Russia's population to continue shrinking into the next century, falling to 135 million by 2050, about the same as what Russia had in 1975. You get the idea though, Russia's demography doesn't look good. And by the way, Putin is very much aware of this. In his now infamous article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, Putin vexes about the possibility of the Russian population decreasing by hundreds of thousands or even millions. And in his 16th annual address to the Duma in 2020, he said that Russia's fate and its historical outlook depends on how many of us there are, before announcing a whole raft of pro-natalist policies, including expanding the so-called maternity capital to single-child families, welfare benefits for children aged 3 to 7 in low-income households, and free school meals for the first 4 years of school. Now, this might not sound like much by Western standards, but it's worth mentioning that Russia is actually very fiscally conservative and has actually run a budget surplus for 5 out of the last 10 years. Unfortunately for Putin, though, these policies don't seem to be having much of an effect. The maternity capital, which is essentially a one-off mortgage payment worth $7,000, was introduced in 2007. And while fertility rates briefly increased to a high of about 1.7 in 2017, they're falling once again, and are now back down to their 2007 level of 1.5. And Russia isn't the only country having this issue. Other countries have found it similarly difficult to artificially stimulate fertility rates by using even the best pro-natalist policies. And, well, the war in Ukraine is only going to make things worse. Thousands of young Russian men will die in the war in Ukraine, while sanctions are expected to cause a 10 to 15% recession in the Russian economy. This will, A, discourage poorer Russians from having children, and B, make it harder for the Russian government to afford the pro-natalist policies, which already aren't doing all that much. Sanctions have also caused a surge in emigration. Some 200,000 Russians have apparently left the country since the war began, which explains why plane ticket prices were up 900% in early March. So that's the TLDR for Russia's demographic crisis, and 3 reasons why it might only get worse, despite Putin's concern and apparent best efforts. Anyway, this video is brought to you by Brilliant. Brilliant is an online STEM learning platform that turns complex subjects into fun and interactive experiences. I actually did a computer science degree, and I've loved exploring Brilliant to refresh my skills, as well as learning new ones to help with my current job, like their superb statistics courses. But you don't need any kind of background in STEM. If you just want to spend a bit of time building your skills, then you can do it right away, with no long boring lectures like the ones I had to sit through. Sorry to my former university. Instead, you can learn through interactive games and puzzles, the kind of thing you actually want to do. There's something at all levels too, with more advanced courses on things like neural networks and even quantum computing. Just pick a course that you're interested in and get started. They're all designed by award-winning instructors and built upon the principle of active learning, so you're gaining STEM knowledge by actually doing it. Brilliant helps you learn new things and sharpen your skills. So if you want to improve with STEM, then you should sign up to Brilliant at brilliant.org/TLDR Global. And the first 200 people to do so will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks so much for supporting the channel.